A few meters from the dirt track, the lioness lay pressed into the brittle grass, her tawny coat dulled by dust and sun, the once golden sheen now muted into the pale tones of the dry season. Her flanks rose and fell in uneven rhythm, the movement shallow and strained as though each breath had to be bargained for. The stark outlines of her ribs stretched her skin with every inhale, then sank again with a faint, shuddering exhale, the effort consuming what little energy remained. Around her hindquarters, flies moved in restless, chaotic loops, drawn by the sour-sweet scent of an unhealed wound, the matted patch of fur darkened with blood that had long since dried at the edges. The thin whip of her tail twitched only once before falling limp, a brief, involuntary sign of life in an otherwise motionless frame. Senior Ranger Daniel Mbatha, whose years in the southern Serengeti had taught him to tell the difference between a predator's deliberate stillness and the quiet of exhaustion, eased his patrol vehicle to a stop and switched off the engine. The deep hum faded into the open air, replaced by a silence that was not truly silent. The whisper of dry grass under a light wind, the distant murmur of wildebeest grazing somewhere beyond sight, and the faint rasp of an animal's breath that could barely hold its own weight against the afternoon heat. He stepped down slowly, his boots pressing into the brittle stems, each step deliberate and measured. The sun was sharp overhead, flattening shadows and leaving nowhere for weakness to hide. As he closed the gap, he could see the way her eyes followed him just enough to mark his presence, the lids heavy as though even that small act cost her. Her ears shifted once toward him, then stilled, no longer swiveling to track the small movements of the plane as a healthy lioness would. There was no defensive growl, no sudden rise to her feet, only the quiet, unnerving fact that she did not move away. That alone told him she was close to the point where instinct had been overtaken by depletion. Kneeling 5 meters from her, Daniel kept his frame low, avoiding any sudden posture that might trigger alarm. His gaze moved over her body in sections, reading the subtle signs the way a tracker reads the earth. Her forelegs were drawn tight to her chest, paws partly curled, claws pressing faintly into the soil, though not in tension. Her abdomen trembled in irregular waves every few breaths, a ripple that hinted at deeper strain, perhaps an injury to the ribs or lungs, perhaps an infection left unchecked. Her left flank lifted slower than the right, an imbalance he knew could mean internal bruising or a puncture wound below the surface. As the dry wind shifted, the scent of her reached him more clearly, the earthy musk of a wild predator layered with the metallic tang of blood and the sour, sickly trace of decay that suggested the wound had been festering for days. Without access to food, dehydration and starvation would now run parallel to the injury, narrowing the already small margin she had to survive. Daniel's mind worked through the plain facts with the same calm pace his body kept on the outside. If she tried to hunt in this condition, the exertion could tear muscle or reopen her wound. If she moved too far from this spot in search of water, she might collapse out of sight, beyond the reach of any help. If she stayed here without intervention, her body might close the wound at the surface, sealing an infection that could finish her in less than a week. The stakes were simple but absolute. Without veterinary aid soon, she would not live. Slowly, he reached into his pack, pulling out a compact field scope and raising it to his eye. Through the glass, the wound near her ribcage showed more clearly. A rough-edged tear where fur had been stripped away, the exposed skin raw and weeping in one small place, the crust of dried blood pulling slightly each time she breathed. The damage was old enough to suggest she had been injured at least 3 days earlier, likely in a territorial clash or failed hunt. Along her shoulder, an older scar tugged faintly with the motion of her chest, evidence of a life already marked by survival. He lowered the scope, speaking in a voice barely above the sound of the wind. "Easy now." It was less for comfort than for consistency, the slow, familiar cadence of a ranger who had spoken to hundreds of animals over decades, not because they understood words, but because they recognized tone. She blinked, the movement unhurried. and her gaze lingered on him for the space of a few breaths before sliding away again. Her breathing rasped through parted jaws, each exhale a dry whisper against the earth. Somewhere behind him, a pair of helmeted guinea fowl burst from the underbrush, their high calls briefly cutting through the moment before fading into the distance. Daniel crouched deeper into the grass, resting his weight evenly to keep his shape low, and reached for the radio clipped to his belt. The unit crackled softly as he keyed the mic, sending his voice across the static. Location, species, visible injury, probable internal trauma. He repeated the coordinates, adding that she was grounded and non-responsive to approach, stressing the urgency in measured words. The vet team, he knew, was at least half an hour away, even if they left immediately. That was time she did not truly have, but it was time he had to hold for her. The minutes stretched in the heat. The grass around them shifted gently with each passing breeze, their dry blades clicking together like brittle paper. He could hear the faint hum of flies over her wound and the occasional twitch of her skin, as she reflexively tried to shake them off without lifting her head. Every few moments her breathing would hitch, a pause longer than it should be, before resuming its uneven pattern. She shifted once, dragging a forepaw slightly through the dust before settling it again, the claws tracing a thin arc in the soil. Daniel's eyes scanned the open land, tracking for any sign of scavengers drawn by the scent of her injury. A lone jackal moved in the distance but kept its course away from them. The wildebeest herd still grazed beyond, their presence irrelevant to her now. This close, her role as predator was stripped away. She was simply an animal on the edge of failure, and he was the thin line between that and a chance at recovery. The Serengeti offered no mercy for weakness. Any delay in care would tip the balance. From far off he caught the faint, low note of an engine. It came in uneven waves at first, masked by the wind, but soon settled into a steady hum. The vet team was closing in. He stayed where he was, neither moving closer nor retreating, maintaining the narrow boundary she seemed willing to allow. The risk remained unchanged until they arrived. If she attempted to rise now, the effort could tear muscle or dislodge clots. If she panicked at their arrival and fled, she could run herself into collapse before they could intervene. For now, survival meant stillness. For her and for him. The heat pressed heavier as the vehicle approached, shimmering waves distorting the horizon behind it. Daniel's gaze never left the lioness. Her eyes opened fully for a moment as the sound drew nearer, then closed again, her head lowering slightly until her chin touched the dust. She was yielding to the only thing left that might help, the patience of a man who had stopped his patrol knowing a delay could mean death, and the arrival of a team whose work might hold the line between this patch of grass and the endless plain beyond. The lioness lifted her head with a slow, deliberate effort, the motion revealing the strain of each muscle as it drew tight, held for a moment, and then settled into a posture that seemed almost suspended in uncertainty. Her eyes, dulled slightly by fatigue yet still carrying that deep amber hue, fixed on Daniel without wavering, and in that instant he knew without doubt that this was the same lioness he had once freed from the grip of a poacher's snare. The memory of that day returned with perfect clarity, the tight coil of steel biting so deeply into her foreleg that the skin around it had swelled in a hard, angry ridge, the smell of blood mixed with the sharp scent of disturbed earth. And the way she had lain still under the weight of pain, but with an alertness that made every move deliberate. They had worked in slow, careful increments, cutting away the twisted wire while her breath came fast and hot in the heat of the afternoon, the wound raw, but her spirit intact. That scar, now faint and partially hidden by fur, marked her as much as it marked his own recollections. Here she was again, months later, her gaze steady, unreadable, and yet tethered to him in a way that made the open space of the Serengeti feel smaller, the moment more intimate than the vast plain suggested. Her head tilted by the smallest fraction, her ears holding still as though weighing what she saw against a memory only she could measure. The brittle grass around her bowed and whispered with the occasional breath of wind, carrying the sense of sun-baked soil and the faint metallic tang of her injury, each detail folding into the fragile truce between them. Daniel shifted his weight minutely, careful to move slowly so as not to fracture whatever invisible thread was holding her in place, his boots pressing lightly into the dry stems. She did not flinch or avert her gaze. Instead, her breathing remained shallow and deliberate, the uneven rise of her ribcage more noticeable now that he was closer, the left side lagging behind the right in a way that hinted at deeper injury, perhaps to the lungs or ribs. He spoke in a voice as low and even as the steady heat in the air, 2 words barely louder than the wind. "It's you." The phrase carried no demand, no urgency, just quiet acknowledgement. And though she gave no obvious sign of understanding, there was a pause in her breathing before it resumed, as if the rhythm had been momentarily interrupted by the sound. It was not recognition in the human sense, but it was not indifference either. There was a quality in her stillness that felt like consideration, a willingness to hold ground instead of retreating. Daniel understood the risk was unchanged. She was injured, her condition weakened, and any movement might drain the small reserve of energy she had left before help could arrive. If she rose now, she might collapse before they could reach her. If she stayed, the heat and the strain could erode what strength remained. Every choice in the next hour carried the weight of survival, and his actions needed to be measured to avoid pushing her toward panic or flight. A pair of oxpeckers passed overhead, their shadows gliding across her face for an instant, and she blinked once, unhurried, before her gaze settled back on him. The faint tremor in her abdomen continued, irregular yet constant, another quiet marker of the damage she carried. Daniel adjusted the radio on his belt, the small click of its casing causing one of her ears to turn toward the sound before relaxing again. A subtle sign that she was aware of and assessing every change in her environment. Time moved slowly in the heat, the sun pressed down, and the air seemed to thicken with its weight, the smell of dust and dried grass mixing with the underlying scent of her wound. He noticed another mark along her side, not from the snare, but an older scar, perhaps from a territorial fight or a failed hunt in the months since their first encounter, a reminder that her survival had been shaped by more than one close escape. Without warning, she shifted her forelegs, drawing herself a little higher so her chest cleared the earth. The movement was deliberate, the kind that costs energy but is chosen with intent, and though she did not advance toward him, the slight change in posture altered the space between them. She was no longer entirely grounded, but neither was she preparing to flee. It felt like a decision, one made on her terms, to meet him from a position of greater presence. Daniel read the change without overstepping, holding his position as she held hers. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of an approaching vehicle became audible, at first barely distinguishable from the wind, but gradually growing clearer. The vet team was drawing closer, but he knew that sound could shift the balance at any moment. If it spurred her into moving, the risk of collapse before they reached her was high. If she endured the wait, her chances of making it through the day increased. The stakes remained exact and unforgiving. Her gaze never left him, her eyes steady and level, and in that quiet exchange, predator and human, memory and present moment, the distance of months and the vastness of the plain seemed to fold into the thin breath of wind passing between them, carrying with it the weight of both recognition and the narrow thread of survival. Ask ChatGPT. Daniel eased his weight to one side, lowering himself into a slow crouch until the brittle grass pressed softly against his knees, the dry stems catching on the fabric of his trousers. The movement was calculated, deliberate, and shaped by years of knowing how even the smallest gesture could tip the balance between calm and flight. He kept his gaze level, but not piercing, careful never to fix his eyes on hers for too long, knowing that in the wild, directness could be read as a challenge. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying the same tone he had used moments earlier, a tone stripped of urgency but threaded with a quiet presence, meant less to communicate meaning than to anchor the stillness they shared. The lioness, lying in her shallow bed of flattened grass, did not advance, nor did she recoil. Instead, only the faintest flick of her tail disturbed her posture, a small, singular motion that felt like the weighing of something unseen, perhaps memory against instinct. The open plain seemed to breathe around them, but in an unusually muted way, as though every sound had taken on weight. The distant silhouettes of antelope grazed with unhurried movements, their shapes wavering in the heat shimmer that danced over the horizon. The wind, which had carried a steady hum earlier, now moved in slower, more deliberate breaths, bringing with it the layered sense of dry soil, crushed grass, and the sharper metallic trace of blood and healing skin. She lay low, her body gathered close to the ground, muscles not taut but held in a quiet readiness, conserving every fragment of her energy. The dull sheen of her coat was broken in places by ridges where fur had been disturbed, the irregular patches speaking of days without proper grooming. Near her flank, a shallow wound caught the light in a fleeting glint, its edges raw but beginning to scab, the kind of injury that told of both endurance and recent hardship. Daniel's eyes moved over her with care, reading the tremor that ran through her breathing, the uneven lift of her rib cage, the left side always lagging behind the right, hinting at deeper damage beneath the surface, perhaps to lung tissue or bone. Her ears shifted subtly in response to his voice, a small pivot that acknowledged his presence without the tension of fear. Every detail was another quiet confirmation of the risks they faced. If she chose to run now, the strain could drain her remaining strength in seconds. If she stayed too long without intervention, infection could tighten its grip, shrinking the narrow space she had left between survival and collapse. He inched himself fractionally closer, not by stepping forward but by easing through the grass, letting the movement sink into the rhythm of the wind so it might pass unnoticed. She followed him with her gaze for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly against the glare, then returned to a steady, unbroken watch. The tail flicked again. Once, sharp and controlled, the only signal that she was registering and processing his approach. She drew in a slow breath, her rib cage lifting in its uneven way, and for an instant, he caught sight of the faint pull along her foreleg where an old scar still lived. The mark left months ago by the poacher's snare. It was more than a scar to him. It was a reminder that she had already endured one ordeal with his help, that her survival in that moment had relied on the same measured patience guiding him now. Around them, the smallest sounds seemed amplified, the faint rasp of her breath moving over the earth, the click of an insect shifting along a dry stem nearby, even the muted thump of his own heartbeat in his ears. He let his voice slip into that space again, no louder than the rustle of the grass. "Stay still, girl," he murmured, not as an instruction meant to control her, but as a quiet request to let the balance hold. She did not blink in direct response, but there was the faintest easing in the line of her shoulders, a tiny softening that suggested she was not preparing to rise. The Serengeti stretched in every direction, its openness both a gift and a threat. It allowed him an unobstructed view of anything that might approach, scavenger, predator, or human. But it also meant she was exposed, her vulnerability visible across the plain. That openness left the moment they occupied balanced on a thin edge, where the wrong sound or wrong step could break it. Somewhere in the far distance, the hum of the vet team's vehicle began to take shape, at first indistinguishable from the breath of the wind, but gradually settling into a rhythm his ears knew well. It was still far enough away not to alter her posture, but Daniel understood how quickly sound could travel over flat ground and how easily it could stir her into action. He matched her stillness with his own, keeping his shoulders loose, his movements minimal, his breathing steady, and holding himself in the same quiet readiness she carried. Then, without the tension of alarm, she moved, just a turn of her head, her ears angling toward a rustle in the grass some distance behind them. Then easing back toward him without the telltale tightening of muscle that precedes flight. It was a choice, small but telling, that she was monitoring her surroundings without abandoning the moment between them. That choice kept him steady, reaffirming that she was not yet driven to leave. The risks remained exact. She could not survive the loss of energy that flight would demand, and she could not afford more time without treatment. Daniel shifted into a slower, deeper kneel, grounding himself more firmly in the earth, a position that would allow him to remain still for as long as necessary. The wind pushed gently at the grass, bending it into uneven, changing shapes, and, for a while, neither of them moved beyond the minor adjustments of breath and blink. In that quiet, the lines between their worlds seemed less distant. A man and a lioness, each holding a fragile place in the wide, exposed heart of the Serengeti, waiting for the moment when one or both would have to move, and knowing that every second they stayed like this kept her survival balanced on a knife edge. She moved with care, her front paw sliding forward into the grass, pressing the stems flat in a slow, deliberate motion. The shift brought her body closer, closing part of the distance that had held them apart since the moment they first locked eyes. Daniel did not move, allowing her to dictate the pace. Every part of him trained to match the unhurried rhythm she chose. When she lowered herself again, the sound was almost imperceptible, a faint settling of weight into the earth. Her head came to rest along the ground, facing him directly now, the pale curve of her muzzle close enough that he could see the faint twitch of her whiskers as she breathed. The breaths were slow, deeper than before, though each still carried the uneven rise between her left and right flanks. The open space between them no longer carried the same charge of uncertainty. It felt instead like a narrow ground they both had stepped onto willingly, fragile and easily disturbed. Her eyes stayed on him, unblinking but soft, and the slow lift and fall of her chest seemed steadier with each passing moment. The twitch of her tail had stilled, replaced by a complete stillness in her lower body that suggested she had made her choice. Not to flee, not to challenge, but to remain. Around them, the plane was held in the same quiet. A lone kite circled high above, its shadow passing over them without altering her calm. The scent of the dry grass mixed with the faint tang of her wound still carried on the wind, a reminder that while she was still, she was far from safe. Any delay in treatment would still give the infection the advantage, and this closeness, while remarkable, did not lessen the risk. Daniel let his knees sink into the ground, lowering his frame further without leaning in. Every movement was slow enough to be read for what it was, not an approach, but a settling. She tracked him for a moment, her gaze shifting slightly as he adjusted, then returning to its steady focus. He could see the faint outline of her ribs now, the dips between them deeper than they should be for a lioness in good health. The old scar on her foreleg was still visible, a pale ridge beneath the fur. And it caught the light in a way that pulled his thoughts back to the snare and the hours spent freeing her from it. That day, too, she had been still under his presence, though that stillness had been born of necessity and pain. Today, it felt different, an unspoken allowance. A light gust passed over them, stirring the grass so that it brushed against her forepaw. She did not shift away, only adjusted her chin fractionally, keeping her head low but her eyes clear on him. He allowed the moment to extend, knowing that pressing it could undo the trust she was offering. The hum of the vet team's vehicle was still distant, but growing. Soon, its presence would reach her ears as well, and then the balance they held might change. If she panicked at the sound, the effort of running could set her back beyond recovery. If she stayed, they could work quickly to give her the care she needed. For now, the space between them felt anchored. He could see the fine dust that clung to the edge of her fur, the small flecks of soil on her muzzle, and the faint movement of her sides as she drew in and released each breath. She blinked slowly once, her lids lowering and lifting without haste, a gesture that was neither signal nor surrender, simply a continuation of the measured calm she was holding. The ground beneath them carried the warmth of the sun, radiating up into the still air. And it seemed to hold them in a pocket of quiet removed from the rest of the plain. Daniel knew the stakes had not shifted despite the closeness. Her survival depended on remaining here until help arrived, on resisting the urge to rise and expend the energy she would need to heal. The risk was as sharp as ever, but in this moment the weight of it felt shared. She had chosen not to put distance between them, and, in the language of the wild, that was as much trust as he could hope to receive without touch. The fragile pact held in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable, as the distant hum of the approaching vehicle grew louder against the hush of the Serengeti. ChatGPT said, "The grazing shapes on the far horizon moved in slow, unbroken lines, the wildebeest shifting through the grass in the steady rhythm of animals that had no reason to hurry. The wind carried the faint grassy scent of their movement. But the lioness only turned her head slightly in their direction, her eyes following them for a moment before returning to Daniel. Her body did not tense, and her shoulders did not gather into the coil that precedes a hunt. The herds were food, opportunity, survival itself. But she stayed where she was, as though the weight of the moment between them held her more firmly than instinct. For a predator in her condition, the choice was telling. A chase now would demand strength she no longer had, and the risk of failure would leave her weaker than before. Remaining here, within reach of help, was her best chance, though she could not know that. Daniel's gaze followed the line of her hindquarters, noting a subtle irregularity in the way her weight shifted when she had stepped forward earlier. The faint limp was there, not severe enough to make her immobile, but enough to remind him of an older injury that had never fully mended. It was the kind of impairment that in good seasons could be carried without consequence, but in leaner times or under the strain of new wounds could tip the balance against her. He knew that if she had tried to hunt in this state, the combined effect of the limp and her current weakness would almost certainly lead to failure, and failure now could mean more than just hunger. The energy lost would push her closer to collapse, and in the open plain, collapse rarely ended without the interference of death or scavengers. The wildebeest drew a little closer, their shadows stretching longer as the light shifted. A few lifted their heads, scanning the open ground in the lioness's direction, but they did not bunch together or scatter. Her stillness kept them calm, her body language carrying none of the cues that would trigger alarm. Daniel saw her ear twitch once toward the sound of their hooves, then angle back toward him. The message in her behavior was simple. For now, she was not hunting. She was choosing to conserve her strength. He shifted slightly where he knelt, the motion slow enough to read as non-threatening, and let his eyes return to the wound along her flank. The edges were dry in places but still raw in others, a sign that healing had begun but had not been supported. Without cleaning, without treatment, infection could outpace the body's effort to repair itself. The faint swelling near the edges told him it might already be starting. He weighed the minutes, counting in his mind how long the vet team would need to reach them. Every minute she stayed was an advantage. Every minute she stayed without panic or movement gave them a better chance to work. The lioness adjusted her forelegs, lowering her chest a little more firmly into the ground, a posture of rest, but not of sleep. Her eyes were half-lidded, scanning the horizon in measured intervals, the herd, the wind-blown grass, the thin strip of sky above Daniel's shoulder. She was still alert, but her breathing had steadied enough to let him believe she could remain here until the team arrived. Still, the risks were unchanging. A sudden noise, a shift in the wind, or the herd drawing too close could alter everything. If she rose too quickly, the injury could tear again. If she tried to hunt, she could exhaust herself beyond recovery. The sun sat lower now, its light softening the edges of the plain, and the wildebeest herd began its gradual drift toward a patch of greener grass in the distance. She watched them go without lifting her head, her chin still resting near the dust. Daniel stayed with her in that steady quiet, aware that each moment they held this fragile stillness was one step closer to her survival. The vet team's approach would soon be audible to her as well, and when it came, he could only hope she chose to trust the space they had kept between them. The grass bent gently under a passing breeze, its movement carrying the scent of the herd away, leaving the two of them once again anchored in the calm center of the open Serengeti. The minutes stretched into a slow, unbroken hour, the light shifting across the plain as Daniel kept his place beside her. He spoke only occasionally, his voice quiet, the tone unchanged from the moment he had first knelt in the grass. The words themselves mattered less than the steadiness with which they came, an anchor in the heat and stillness. The lioness blinked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each closure of her eyes lingering just long enough to suggest she was willing, if only for moments, to surrender her constant watch. At times, her lids lowered completely, the curve of her head settling a fraction deeper into the earth before she opened them again to take in the horizon. The stillness was not sleep, but it was a kind of rest, one she might not have allowed if he had not held his place without intrusion. Her breathing came in a steady pattern now, though the uneven rise of her ribs was still present, a quiet reminder of what lingered beneath the surface. Daniel kept his eyes on the faint swell near her wound, noting the slight tension in the muscles there each time she inhaled. The scent of the injury carried lightly in the air between them, mixing with the warm, dusty smell of sun-baked grass. Every so often, a small insect landed on her flank, prompting the twitch of skin or a brief flick of her ear, but otherwise she remained unmoving. He was careful to match that stillness, his body language as calm as hers, because the balance they held was narrow and fragile. If she rose now, the strain could undo the healing that had begun. If she stayed, the chance of stabilizing her before infection took hold grew stronger with every passing minute. From time to time her gaze found him, and though her eyes gave no human signal, there was a constancy in them, the kind that measured presence not by intent, but by action. Months ago she had allowed him close in the desperate hours of the snare's hold. Today she was allowing it again without the force of injury holding her down. It was a difference he did not ignore. His hands remained still on his knees, his breathing even, as he listened for the low hum of the approaching vehicle. The sound had grown marginally louder, a faint promise carried on the wind, but still far enough that it did not yet trouble her. The plain around them held its own vigil. A pair of crowned lapwings called briefly before vanishing into the distance. Shadows from the scattered acacias lengthened, stretching across the open ground. The breeze came and went in irregular pulses, bending the grass first one way, then another, brushing against them both. Each time it passed, it carried away the harsher scent of her wound, replacing it with the faint sweetness of dry vegetation. The wildebeest herd that had grazed along the horizon earlier was gone from sight, their absence leaving the landscape emptier but no less watchful. She shifted once, a slow adjustment of her foreleg beneath her chest, and settled again without lifting her head. Daniel read the movement as both a sign of discomfort and a decision to remain. He leaned forward by a fraction, letting his voice thread into the space between them. "You're almost there," he murmured, the syllables low and measured. Her ear turned slightly toward him before easing back to its neutral angle. The response was minimal, but it was enough to tell him she was aware of his words, if not their meaning. Time inched forward, marked not by the clock but by the changing light and the gradual strengthening of the sound he was waiting for. When the vehicle finally drew close enough that its low vibration touched the ground beneath them, he felt her body tense, just a small tightening along her shoulders and back, not yet the shift of rising. He remained exactly as he was, letting the moment pass without pushing her to react. The stakes were sharp. If she chose to flee now, she could lose the precious stability she had held for the last hour. If she stayed, help could reach her without the risk of further injury. The vehicle's sound pressed closer, folding into the quiet of the Serengeti until it seemed part of it. She exhaled slowly, her head still on the ground, and her eyes drifted half shut once more. Daniel kept his place, waiting for the moment when his stillness would hand her into the care of those arriving, knowing that in this hour, the trust she had given him had been as important as the medical work to come. The grass bent once more under a light wind, its movement passing over them both, and the plane settled again into the rhythm of its long, patient watch. She rose without the gathering signs that usually came before. No deepening of breath, no shifting of weight through her forelegs, only the smooth, sudden motion of a body lifting from the ground. Daniel remained still, his hands resting loosely on his knees, watching her advance with the unhurried steps of an animal that had already decided where it would stop. The grass bent under her weight, releasing a dry whisper into the air, and then she was beside him, her shadow mingling with his. The distance they had held for so long was gone in an instant, replaced by a closeness measured not in centimeters, but in trust. Her shoulder came to rest so near his own that the heat of her body pressed faintly into the space between them. She lowered herself again, this time with a care that seemed deliberate, folding her limbs beneath her until her chest met the ground. The exhale that followed was long and slow, the kind that emptied not only her lungs but also some unseen tension that had held her since the moment they first saw each other. Daniel did not reach for her. The pact they shared needed no touch to confirm it. Instead, he let the stillness settle around them both, the sounds of the plane becoming softer, as though distance had stretched between this patch of ground and everything else. Her breathing steadied beside him, the uneven lift of her ribs still present but gentler now, and her head angled slightly so that her gaze swept the same open horizon he was watching. The curve of her flank rose and fell in a rhythm that matched the quiet calm of the moment, each breath deliberate, unhurried. She twitched her ear once at the hum of the vet vehicle drawing closer, but she did not move away. The choice to remain, this close, in full reach, was her own, and in the wild, such a choice was never given lightly. He let his voice enter the moment only once, barely above the sound of her breath. "You're safe." The words were neither command nor comfort in the human sense, but a continuation of the tone he had held since the start, steady, even, without demand. She gave no sign of hearing them beyond the steady exhale that followed, her body still grounded beside him. The risks, however, did not dissolve with her closeness. Every second still carried the weight of her injury, the possibility that the sound of approaching humans could startle her into rising too soon, undoing the fragile stability they had built. If she bolted now, her wounds could tear, and her energy could drain faster than she could recover. The hum of the vehicle was no longer a distant thread. It had substance now, a sound that carried over the grass and settled into the earth beneath them. She shifted her hind leg slightly, the limp still visible in that brief movement, then settled again. Her head lowering to the ground so her jaw rested in the grass, the line of her body angled toward him, not squarely facing, but close enough that the curve of her back paralleled his. The stillness deepened, the moment holding steady against the pull of time and distance. Daniel kept his focus outward, scanning the plane, but he was aware of every small movement beside him. The slow blink of her eyes, the faint twitch of skin over her ribs as a fly landed and departed, and the warmth radiating from her flank. It was a closeness that could not be forced and could not be repeated on command. It existed only because of the path that had led them here, through injury, memory, and the long patience of waiting. The approaching team would change the shape of this moment, but for now, in the narrowing space before they arrived, it remained untouched. The grass leaned under a passing gust, brushing lightly against both man and lioness. Neither moved. They stayed anchored in that shared stillness, a living thread between two lives that would soon diverge again, one returning to the wild, the other watching her go. And in that open stretch of the Serengeti, where space was endless and survival rarely allowed for such closeness, Their brief, wordless pact held firm, unbroken until the sound of the vehicle reached their ears in full. She rose slowly, the movement beginning with a subtle shift of weight through her forelegs. Muscles stretching in a quiet ripple beneath her coat. The grass, pressed flat by her rest, brushed back against her limbs as she straightened. Her head lifted first, scanning the plain with the same measured care she had shown throughout the long hours, ears turning toward the faint hum of the now idling vehicle in the distance. Daniel stayed still, his body language unchanged, offering her no reason to feel pressed. For a moment, she stood without moving forward, the wind running along her flanks and stirring the fine dust clinging to her fur. Her breathing, though still uneven, held the steady rhythm of an animal choosing movement by intent rather than urgency. She turned her head toward him then, her gaze holding for several breaths in the quiet space they shared. There was nothing in it for him to name, no signal, no human expression. Only the unbroken fact of attention, fixed on him and not the open ground ahead. It lasted just long enough for the moment to settle between them, as if the air itself needed to hold it in place before letting it go. Then she shifted, her front paw pressing down into the dry soil, followed by the slow extension of her hind leg, the limp visible but not halting her progress. The line of her body angled toward the horizon, her weight set into a pace that neither hurried nor faltered. Daniel's eyes followed the movement, noting how her tail hung low but loose, swaying with each step, the old injury in her leg making a faint asymmetry in her gait. It was not the stride of full strength, but it was enough. Enough to cover ground, enough to carry her back to the range of her own life. The vet team would still track her for a time, ensuring the work they had done could hold, but she was already moving beyond the boundary where their presence would matter. Out here, distance could grow quickly. In a matter of minutes, she would be nothing more than a pale ripple of movement in the tall grass. The light was changing, the edges of the plain softening as the sun dropped toward the far ridgeline. The air carried the cool shift of evening, and the grass leaned in gentle waves under a passing breeze. Daniel kept his place, watching her thread her way through the swaying stems until only the faint movement of grass marked her path. She did not look back again. But he held the image of that last moment, the way she had met his gaze before leaving, as firmly as if it had been placed into his hands. In the wild, such closeness did not linger. It passed as quietly as it arrived, leaving only its weight in memory. She moved deeper into the open, her form slipping in and out of sight as the land folded around her, until finally there was no trace of her at all. Daniel remained where he was for a while longer, the wind brushing past him in the same soft rhythm it had carried across them both. Somewhere ahead, she would find her place again in the vastness, carrying whatever strength had been restored in her. And as the sun drew the horizon into shadow, the grass bent once more under the fading light, the plain returning to its endless, patient watch.